Guru, you are listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis. Norman Richmond, Lisa Watson is on the buttons, and we are joined. First, I should have mentioned that we just completed the Jazz Zone, and he in Providence paid tribute to the late, great Roy Ayers, a young man from born and raised in Los Angeles, California. He went to Jefferson High School in Los Angeles, California. And we are talking to Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Gerald Horne has about 50 books out there, and his latest book is Capital.
What is just a reconciliation.
Something went wrong with my computer. Sorry about that. What's the name of your latest book on capital and slavery?
Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865. Book signing at Sisters Place on Nostrand Avenue in deepest, darkest Brooklyn on October 10th, on October 17th at Montgomery College in Silver Spring, Maryland, both beginning in the early evening. Be there or be square.
All right. And today is the centenary of a young man by the name of Jimmy Reed. Jimmy Reed was one of my father's favorite musicians, and he was the man who really influenced Bob Dylan. He was a harmonica player, a guitar player, singer, songwriter, and I love Jimmy Reed. I listen to Jimmy Reed almost every other day. One of my favorite songs that they did was Big Boss Man and Bright Lights, Big City. And it's my understanding that Dr. Gerald Horne used to sing Jimmy Reed's songs himself. Am I correct in saying that?
I'm afraid so. Some decades ago, I organized a blues band and toured Baku, Azerbaijan, Moscow, the city then known as Leningrad, today St. Petersburg. And part of my repertoire were some of these songs you just mentioned.
You got me doing what you want me, baby. Why you wanna let go? Yeah, going up, going down. Yep, I can sing Jimmy Reed's songs backwards because he was high on my pops. Well, I shouldn't say my pops. Not only my father, my uncles, my aunts. As you know, with your Mississippi roots, you know Jimmy Reed was he was huge in the African community as well as in England. The Stones and all of the biggest rock bands worship him, and Bob Dylan was basically patterned himself after Jimmy Reed, wouldn't you say?
Oh, sure. And of course, his roots are in Mississippi, like mine, for example. And he later, like so many from the Magnolia State, migrated northward to Chicago. Chicago, of course, is full of Black Mississippians, perhaps the most prominent of that crew being the late novelist Richard Wright, perhaps the leading novelist we produced to this point, notably his novel Native Son. Of course, he eventually went into exile in Paris, France, where he died mysteriously.
And let me say that, and we'll leave this alone. He wrote a book called Black Power, before Kwame Ture and Rick and Willie Ricks hollered Black Power. Mr. Wright wrote a book called Black Power in 1954.
And of course, he was one of the few Black Americans who attended the Bandung Conference of 1955, which was a notable event featuring not only Indonesian leaders, of course it took place in Indonesia, but also emerging African leaders and Asian leaders, such as the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, not to mention Joseph Broz Tito of Yugoslavia.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir. And his daughter, Julia, is still still in the land of the living. But I'm going to let Melinda kick off the interview.
Yeah, left on the deck is the Bolivia crisis.
Well, it was a real setback that took place some days ago when the movement towards socialism, which had been in power in the South American nation for roughly 20 years, was defeated soundly, getting single digits. Part of the problem, and this is a lesson for us all to ponder, was internal conflict at the highest level between the former leader, Evo Morales, a man of indigenous ancestry, and his successor, Luis Arce. They could not come to a meeting of the minds, and as a result, that project went down to flaming defeat. And I think that our Cuban friends and our Venezuelan friends in particular are trying to draw the appropriate lesson from that setback in Bolivia, because it's apparent and evident that if there is quarreling and squabbling at the highest levels, it amounts to political suicide.
Oh, yeah. Had you finished, Dr. Horne?
Yes, sir.
Can we talk about the SCO in China and the 80th anniversary of the victory over of Japan? And is a new world order emerging?
I believe that a new world order is emerging. And in fact, on the Wednesday program that I do on a regular basis, 8 p.m. Eastern, we try to include the ditty from the late Curtis Mayfield New World Order, but it was removed from YouTube as a copyright infringement. But in any case, what we were trying to signal by playing that song is that we are entering a new international situation. And in fact, let me digress for a second and say that as we speak, I'm working on a book tentatively entitled The Long Detour, Sino-Soviet Split and the Rise and Fall of U.S. Imperialism. And as that title suggests, when China was won over on an anti-Soviet basis to the ranks of imperialism, imperialism thought that it had pulled a fast one. Certainly, it contributed in the transition from a so-called bipolar world, that's to say a world pivoting around Washington and Moscow, to a so-called unipolar world after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. But now, with particularly this spectacular military parade in Beijing this past Wednesday, it's apparent that we're entering a multipolar world. What I mean by that is that Russia obviously is not going to be won over. At least it does not appear to be the case that it will be won over to the ranks of U.S. imperialism, although Mr. Trump said that that was one of his major tasks entering office in January 2025. And if you study that military parade, China apparently has the kind of weaponry that can make those in the Pentagon weep. And perhaps it's not coincidental that the U.S. Department of Defense changed its name this week to the U.S. Department of War. Because it's apparent that war might be the only way out for U.S. imperialism to overcome the Chinese lead economically, because by some measures, the Chinese economy is already 30% larger than the U.S. economy. And certainly, if you look at green technology, if you look at quantum computing, if you look at the emerging field of artificial intelligence, recall what we talked about a few months ago, the rise of DeepSeek in China, spending $6 million compared to US AI spending billions, that China is going to be difficult to overcome. And I would point the audience to an op-ed on the website of the New York Times as we speak, penned by former State Department official Kurt Campbell with a K, and former National Security member Rush Doshi, yes, Doshi, he's of South Asian descent. And they point out, and they say this with no satisfaction, that US imperialism can only overcome China at this point if it repairs relations with India, with the European Union, with Japan, South Korea, Mexico. But that does not seem to be in the offing, because Mr. Trump has slapped eye-watering tariffs on all of those erstwhile US allies, and they are going to have a hard time reconciling with US imperialism. And that is one of the many reasons why we say that we are entering a new international situation. Now, whether or not that is good news for the US domestic constituency is another question. Certainly, it's good news for the global constituency, because the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, headed by China and Russia, has set up a SCO bank, not unlike the BRICS bank, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And a lot of capital will be flowing into Africa and the Caribbean. Footnote, as we speak, convening in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, is the first face-to-face summit of the African Union and the Caribbean community. I've already gotten messages from that gathering. It is of historic and earth-shattering consequence. I dare say, although my person who supplied the message did not mention this, that Chinese, Russian, India, and Japanese diplomats are all hovering on the sidelines of this meeting. Speaking of Japan, it may have something to lose with regard to this ascension of China, because many in China have yet to forgive or forget the depredations inflicted by Imperial Japan in China between 1931 and 1945. That may help to account for another epical event that took place a week or so ago. And I think we might have mentioned it last week. If not, it bears reiteration. In Yokohama, a Japan-African summit where Japan, among other things, pledged to train 30,000 African specialists in artificial intelligence. So the world is changing as we speak, and reverting to the previous point as to whether or not the US domestic constituency can profit from this change, it's unclear, because the US domestic constituency has yet to recover from the Red Scare, has yet to recover from the retreat of internationalism. Most of our leaders, intellectuals, organizations, they pay little or no attention to what's going on outside of the United States of America. They have no analysis with regard to the rise of China, except that many are hostile to it. And so it's also evident that Mr. Trump, in order to compensate for losses abroad, may very well decide to crack down even further at home, hence the sending of National Guard personnel to Washington, to Los Angeles. As we pointed out previously, it's not just that these cities have sizable Black populations. If you have a sizable Black population but don't have a Black mayor, you usually get an exemption. I'm thinking of Detroit, for example, which does not have a Black mayor. I'm thinking of St. Louis, for example, which does not have a Black mayor. So we're in uncharted waters, to use the preferred cliche of many in the mass media nowadays. But certainly when historians look back, they will inevitably agree that the first week of September of 2025 was the beginning of a major retreat for US imperialism, as reflected in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, which was attended by India. Mr. Trump alienated India. Of course, the scuttlebutt is that he's gotten into a business relationship with the Pakistanis in the field of cryptocurrency. That is the allegation of Jake Sullivan, the former Biden national security advisor. And as a result, he stabbed India in the back, but India retaliated by Prime Minister Modi making his first trip in 7 years to China, where he was spotted holding hands with President Xi and President Putin simultaneously. So once again, the news from the international front is rather bracing and also leaves considerable room for optimism.
But Dr. Horne, I have a question for you about the head of state of Barbados, Mia Mottley. Now, she is a lesbian. How do you think, a lot of people, not just African people, have problems with her sexuality? How do you think that is a very significant that she would be leading the charge of Africans from the West at that particular meeting, don't you think?
Well, I'm not so sure, because first of all, as a head of government, as a prime minister, she is at an elevated level, and exceptions are oftentimes made for those at such a level. Number two, I try to follow Barbadian events and Caribbean events very carefully. And the fact that she is a lesbian comes as news to me. So it may not necessarily be a matter of knowledge to begin with. And in any case, I revert to point number one, which is that as a prominent and powerful personality, there are different rules of engagement that she faces.
Yeah, but a lot of people see her as a staunch anti-imperialist. So I think a lot of people would give her a pass on the sexuality question.
Well, I should say, which we got to the latter point, some of my Haitian friends are upset with her policies on Haiti.
Yes.
So I'm not so sure if they would welcome her into the ranks of the anti-imperialists.
Yeah, that's we could do a whole show on that. But Melinda, you have some more questions?
Did you finish your thing around India, U.S. and alienate India?
Just a footnote. I mean,
yeah.
Mr. Trump, I mean, he's so erratic. And I think that this is one of the reasons why increasingly there are those in his class who are turning against him. I'm pointing you to an edition of the Financial Times of London, the front page just a few days ago, where Ray Dalio, a hedge fund billionaire headquartered in Connecticut, not part of the 1%, but the 0.00001%, denounced Mr. Trump in no uncertain terms. Jeffrey Sonnenfeld of the Yale School of Management, who styles himself as a billionaire whisperer and a CEO whisperer, reports that many in that class are upset with Mr. Trump, but they're afraid to speak out because Mr. Trump, of course, can be very vindictive. And I think that this also points to something we've talked about before, but has not necessarily been engaged by many of our friends on the left, which is this class lineup under settler colonialism, whereby it's no accident that a system like settler colonialism, based from its inception in the 16th century in what is called North Carolina, as a heterogeneous mixture of Europeans migrated across the Atlantic with the purpose of uprooting the indigenous and taking their land and then forcing Africans at gunpoint to work for free. That was a class collaborationist project. And November 2024, with the election of Mr. Trump, was a class collaborationist project. And the class politics of the settler colonialism can be very tricky. And what happens is that many of our friends on the left basically, and not only mean radicals, but liberals too, they become sort of vulgar socialists and vulgar Marxists. And they automatically assume that settler descendants who are not of means will lean in a progressive direction, although there are volumes of history in the United States that point otherwise. As you know, we mentioned Mississippi. One of my current projects deals with slavery in Mississippi. One of the richest men in the world in Mississippi on the eve of the U.S. Civil War was Stephen Duncan, the biggest landowner and slave owner in Mississippi. He opposed secession from the United States, which ignited the U.S. Civil War, because he thought, contrary to our liberal apologists today, that the U.S. Constitution basically sanctioned slavery. And of course, that was the early position of Abraham Lincoln, which is why he was only against expansion and extension of slavery to begin with. It was the foot soldiers of the army that almost defeated the Lincoln government. It was heavily comprised of non-slave owning settler descendants who were fighting to preserve a system of slavery, which theoretically meant that they were fighting to preserve a system where enslaved Africans served as a drag on their working conditions and wages, which makes little sense from a traditional class perspective, but does make sense if you think about settler colonialism and societies built upon the elevation of Europeans to the ranks of exploiters, as overseers, and enslavers, which is what these foot soldiers thought that they had to gain. And so, once again, Mr. Trump has profited handsomely from a deeper understanding of the political reality of the United States, and our side may suffer grievously because of an inability to grasp the nettle of class collaboration and what it means under settler colonialism.
You are listening to Diasporic Music. We're on the line with Dr. Gerald Horne. And Melinda, some more questions?
Yeah. So does that mean that this new thing with India, is it similar to China and the, what happened with China and against the anti-Soviet cabal?
That is possible. That's why what happened this past week is so profound. For decades, U.S. imperialism has been trying to woo India. And within a matter of days, you saw that Mr. Trump blew that relationship up. Just like a turning point with regard to the demise of the Soviet Union was China being won over by Washington on an anti-Soviet basis, a turning point for the demise of U.S. imperialism and all of its comrades may be India turning its back on imperialism. Now, are you still there?
Yes, sir.
Oh, okay, sorry. Now, let's not get ahead of ourselves. India still has a close relationship with Japan. In fact, Mr. Modi traveled to Japan right before going to India. Their relationship stretches back hundreds of years to the founding of Buddhism. I've mentioned more than once that when Tokyo war criminals were put on trial in 1945, the only judge on the panel, who happened to be Indian, he would stand up as the accused would enter the courtroom. As you know, traditionally, the defendants stand up when the judge enters the courtroom.
Right.
So there has been a very close relationship between India and Japan that could still throttle the ambitions of the People's Republic of China. But once again, in order to figure out where this small planet is going, we're going to have to do a careful and close analysis. And thus far, that kind of careful and close analysis has not been the forte of many of our friends on the left.
Can we talk about the situation? Venezuela is one of the most burning questions that we're dealing with at this moment in history. Wouldn't you say? Could you talk about the Hands Off Venezuela movement?
Well, yes. Mr. Trump, once again, just a few days ago, blew up a boat in international waters that he said was heading to the United States with drugs. In a sense, he was really just imitating his predecessor, Mr. Obama, who used to meet on Tuesday afternoons to draw up a list of those that were deemed to be, quote, terrorists, unquote, and then subjected to a drone killing. It was decided that incineration was better than incarceration. And in many ways, it reminds me of settler colonialism, because if you look at settler colonialism, the plan to liquidate the indigenous population has left many, including many of our friends on the left, that there is no such thing as an indigenous question, because they're hard. I mean, you know, of course, the population has recovered. But if you look at a state like Texas, for example, where that incineration, not incarceration, a platform reached its zenith, there's hardly any discussion of an indigenous question. And so Mr. Trump has basically helped to convert U.S. imperialism into murder incorporated. And it's the equivalent of a police officer seeing a suspected drug dealer on the streets of Houston and comes up to him and puts a bullet through his brain. I mean, it's that sort of piracy, it's that sort of brigandage, it's that sort of outrage that is presumably a prelude to bloodshed. That is to say, an invasion of Venezuela to grab its oil. And with the U.S. investment in oil in neighboring Guyana and the grabbing of Venezuelan oil and an impending attack on Iran expected by the end of the year, the U.S. imperialism feels that it will have leverage over peers and rivals alike, notably China and the European Union, by controlling oil supply to these gigantic economies. But I suspect that what Mr. Trump is trying to do is put so much external pressure on Venezuela, sending nuclear submarines to the shores of Venezuela, for example, that he feels that it will spur a coup against Mr. Maduro. The problem he has there is that the Venezuelans are aided by expert Cuban intelligence. President Petro of Colombia is hotly opposed to an invasion of his neighbor, unlike Trinidad and Tobago, for example, whose prime minister virtually endorsed an invasion, believe it or not. And so Mr. Trump may see this Venezuela plan blow up in his face. At least that is the hope in Caracas.
I think this is going to be the last question, Dr. Horne. But is Barack Hussein Obama, is he the king of the drones in terms of sending drones to other people's countries? Can our brother? Is there anybody that outdroned him, or is he the absolute king when it came to dealing with drones?
Well, I'm glad you raised that question, not only because I can verify your supposition, but also in terms of that impressive military parade in China this past Wednesday. Perhaps the most startling aspect is the Chinese development of drones, underwater drones, which can potentially neutralize U.S. nuclear submarines, hypersonic drones that could turn the crown jewel of the U.S. Navy, speaking of aircraft carriers, into floating caskets. This is one of the reasons why there's so much hysteria in Washington. As a matter of fact, in the United States this week, it reminded me of the collapse on Wall Street of 2008, 2009, when there was hysteria on the faces of the usually tranquilized spokespersons of imperialism. You saw that same sort of hysteria this past week. The problem, of course, is that when they get hysterical, sometimes like a patriarch, they'll strike out those within their range, means people like myself.
And I started to say thank God, but as George Clinton would say, thank God you crossed the border. You're a little bit safer, I guess.
Well, time will tell.
Is there anything else you would like to add,
let you know,
sir?
for those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, it's not because we love revolution. It is historically determined.
All right,
and we
thank
have
you.
no
And
alternative but to follow
Melinda
history
Francis,
and to
I
use
guess I would
history
like
for
to
the
thank
benefit of our people.
Lisa.
Power to the people. Power to the people.